Right, so let's start off with a definition of reflexivity. So this is my own. It's the regular exercise of the mental ability shared by all normal people to consider themselves in relation to their social contexts and vice versa. Normal people just means not pathological, not physiologically damaged. It's the common sense, everyday meaning. So it's something we all have. But I want to argue that the dominant type of reflexivity varies with, how long do I have? 40 minutes, so that takes us till past. Okay. The dominant type of reflexivity that most of us practice is marked. Now this is not a typology, and we all use all modes of reflexivity all of the time. And I gave you a made-up example in one of the books about how this works. So for those of you who didn't come across it, it really began with me and my car playing up, going into a garage. And eventually I changed it because I ran out of technical terms for car engines, and started with a man who wakes up one morning for the first time in his life, young man, with toothache, very painful toothache. And he just doesn't know what to do, no past experience. So, just a quick sketch of his day. He goes into work and he talks to his close colleagues. What do you do when you've got toothache? So he's behaving like a communicative reflexive, as I call them. We'll come to that in a second. And they give him all sorts of good advice, which basically means we end up going to the dentist. So he, being a good communicative for half an hour, decides he will go to the dentist. Then, as an autonomous, in the autonomous mode, he finds his way by map or knowledge across the road and looks at the first two dental practices that he encounters. The first one he finds a bit dirty, a bit old-looking, and thinks, no, very autonomous thought, I can do better than that. And he goes along to a nearby one, number 2, and he looks at their price list, and he thinks that is very expensive. So finally, as an autonomous, he finds a third one, and he behaves then as a meta-reflexive. Yes, I can afford it. Yes, it looks clean and reasonable. I will go inside and evaluate how I feel about it then. It's very reflexive to be critical of oneself and critical of one's context simultaneously. It's like the many times all of us have walked into a restaurant and also walked out again. But no, it seems okay. So he starts making a booking with the dental receptionist. And she says to him, well, the procedure will, have you been before? Has this happened to you before? No, never, he says. Okay, she says, well, you know, we have to put an anesthetic in to stop it hurting. He says, what, a needle? Yes, but it doesn't hurt. He's just got this mental image of a needle. And, he says, just one. And he said, well, one on the outside of the gum and the other on the other side of the tooth. And then you have to wait a bit. And then with a machine, he will pull your tooth out. And she illustrates. And he turns fractured reflexive. He just panics. He thinks, I can't stand this. I don't know what to do. I can't stand the toothache, and I can't stand the thought of having the tooth out, extracted. So that's just a made-up example of how one perfectly normal person, confronted with something new, can go through all four modes of reflexivity in the course of that particular experience. Now, that is just made up. What is not made up is the last paragraph or bullet point here, which says why we should bother about reflexivity. It's not because it's particularly fascinating. There are many fascinating things in social theorizing. But I'm making a much stronger claim that it is always indispensable. And that's a very strong claim. The claim is literally no reflexivity, no society. Now, how can one justify that ontological claim? I argue in four ways. Reflexivity is necessary for us to appropriate any social role that is proposed for us or an obligation that we take up. Now, I'm going to be talking purely about the social order, and you know I believe that there's a natural order and also a practical order and also a transcendental order, but let's focus on the social because time is so short. What do I mean by any role that one is obligated to take up? Well, think of an early society in which the village elder at some festival, initiation ceremony, whatever, announces, well, now is the time for all young men who have been through most of the initiation rites to kill a tiger. This used to be the case in Tanzania and next door. Or it could be, now is the time for all young men who have already killed their tiger to take a wife. Now, there's a reflexive process involved in this. It's not just the village elder declares this. This is what John Searle says, you know, things become social facts through declaration. They don't. Out of all those young men standing there of the appropriate age and experience, they have to say, this declaration applies to me. I have to do something. And unless they do that, nothing happens. So no marriages, no dead tigers, and a dead tiger qualifies you to be a warrior in the Maasai tribe, for example. So reflexivity is crucial for dealing with the appropriation of social expectations. That's point one. Point two, it's essential for dealing with unscripted contingencies. Suppose your flock of animals, I've seen this with the wildebeeste in the Serengeti. Normally they migrate on a historic path. Don't ask me how they know it. They're wildebeeste, not human subjects. I can't ask them. Normally they migrate on this path. But suppose we've had some extreme climatic conditions and that path has been washed out, and what they're really going in search of is water, But if there's enough water there, they might decide they will remain there, not migrate that year. Now, somebody has to emerge as leader, or the leader has to prove himself as being a good leader, and produce an ad hoc solution to this problem. It may be as simple as saying, okay guys, we stay here, right? Or it may be we follow traditional custom and practice, and we herd the wildebeest along the usual migration trail, because that way we're sure of water. But they may be challenged, and somebody may say, but, you know, if there's waters here and there isn't usually water here, how do we know that because there's usually water there, there will still be water there? And of course they don't know. So reflexively, somebody has to make a bet about what the best course of action is and to stand by that. And finally, reflexivity is necessary for coping with contingencies, and coping with that particular contingency, which consists in two social roles clashing. Now, I once wrote an article way back in the 80s called The Myth of Cultural Integration, which always assumed that cultures were so perfectly dovetailed that nothing clashed within them. But things often clash. You like going back to the classics, so let's go back to Antigone. Antigone is in two roles, and they're in conflict with one another. She's in the role of being the king's niece, King Creon's niece, and therefore bound by the royal edict, which says you shall not bury enemies. But one of the enemies is also her brother, and family rules say you shall see to the burial of your brother. Now, my argument is only Antigone can decide which of those rules associated with two different roles she will play. And she can only do it reflexively by saying things to herself like, I care about my brother much more than I care about being loyal to the king, or vice versa. It's up to her. She might well die either way for having broken one of these rules, but at least she's got a choice reflexively how she will die. Now that leads us to the summary reason for why we do need to talk about reflexivity, because it is how culture and structure influence agency. If we don't have the active subject reflexively looking and evaluating what they are supposed to do, or what they are being pushed to do by constraints or enablements from the social structure, then we are back into an account which many people call social hydraulics, where people are either pushed by the constraints and pulled by the enablements, but they themselves have nothing to do with the matter. In other words, agency has been excluded. So those, in short, are the reasons why we do need to talk about and think about reflexivity, and particularly to think about the ways in which it takes place. Now, this is a sort of historical puzzle to me about the history of sociology. I certainly didn't invent the internal conversation. Charles Saunders Peirce did in the 19th century, or very early 20th century. And he used the internal conversation significantly in his works. But it never led anywhere. And when we got the revival of pragmatism, which prides itself on giving due honour and respect to the great American pragmatists, particularly to Peirce and to Mead, much was taken up from the two of them, but not the inner conversation. Why? It is a puzzle. Of course, the inner conversation is not an observable, it's not amenable to sense data, and there is a strong amount of empiricism within pragmatism. It's something you said in your recent book, Doug. And therefore, I'm puzzled. Somebody with expertise on the period probably could solve that puzzle. Next, when the great American pragmatists, and I would include both Dewey and the psychologist, James, thank you, William James, in this list of the four, when they do talk about the inner conversation, they assume that they're all talking about the same thing, and that thing is the same for everybody who uses it. And I want to disagree with that. I also want to disagree with the idea that it is unchanging over time. In 1934, Vygotsky called for a history of reflexivity. I think that was a very, very good call to make, needed. So we have these four modes of practicing the internal conversation. The first I call communicative reflexivity, when any subject is capable of starting an internal conversation, but for some reason they require other people who I call their interlocutors, people who are familiar to them, friendly to them, they trust. So this is a reflexive relationship, but it is very much a relational product. They require confirmation and encouragement from these other people, and then they can go ahead and confirm what action they're going to take. Now, this is the whole point about introducing reflexivity, because I believe passionately that everyone is, apart from people in a coma or, you know, induced or otherwise, everybody is an active agent. Then we need to know, in the same circumstances, the answer to the question, what will they do? Because the fact that the circumstances are identical does not mean that they will all do identical things. Now, what communicative reflexivity tends to do is to promote conventional responses to situations. So one example I often use is a couple of retired people living on a pension for two people, but they're getting poorer because there is inflation in their country. Now, some empiricist investigators will say, when asked, well, what will they do? Because the only thing that happens to them universally is that they all become worse off. But that doesn't tell you what they do. Some very confident outside observers will say, oh, they'll cut luxuries. That means they will trade off heating against eating, or achieve some balance between poorer eating and poorer heating. They'll cut the luxuries. But who are they to say that those are the luxuries to that couple? Maybe that couple have children grown-up children who are far away, and one of their most important concerns in life is staying in touch with those kids. So having the phone taken out, or stopping paying the monthly charge on a mobile, will not be a luxury to them, something they can cut. Maybe they will cut both heating and eating in order to keep phoning their children. And people vary along so many different respects that you simply cannot itemize them. They value different things, they will pay in different currencies, they will make different amounts of effort for things that matter to them. So the communicative reflexives will tend to follow the pattern that's conventional to their group. Whereas the autonomous reflexives are people who are perfectly capable of making a decision themselves and then doing it. So, for example, this is a conversation I had with my own mother when she had to enter a care home with loss of mobility. And I put this example to her of the couple living on the fixed pension. And she said yes. And I said, well, you know, one of the solutions could be to buy your clothes from charity shops. Oh, my mother was absolutely horrified. She said, well, you wouldn't do that. I said, excuse me, this jacket I'm wearing came from Oxfam. She said, well, that's terrible. But an autonomous reflexive who particularly wants, you know, a new record, a new book, a new laptop, whatever it may be, can make their own mind up in their own internal conversation. Either I won't have any new clothes at all, I can get by, or if I'm desperate, I'll go and use Oxfam. Meta-reflexives are quite different again. They're critically reflexive about their own internal conversations, and therefore they're never satisfied, fully satisfied, with the decisions that they reach. They always think that the decision may not be bad, but it could be better, and even better is the enemy of best. So they never think they have acted in the best way possible under the given circumstances. And they're critical about effective action anyway. So if you take the parable of the Good Samaritan, it looked as though, given he'd decided to help the wounded man, that there was only one course of action, and maybe there was in this parable. Just take him to the closest inn and pay for him to be looked after until you come back through. But the meta-reflexive in a modern society, if they see a wounded person after a pedestrian has been knocked down by a car, is faced with all sorts of choices. Take them to accident and emergency of a hospital, take them to the nearest doctor, look up on the internet what to do to somebody with these symptoms. It's not an unrealistic thing if it's the middle of the night and you're in a lonely part of the country, and so on and so forth. And then they will go on being critical. The meta-reflexive never really stops being critical, both of themselves and of their social context. Why is the wait so long in the accident and emergency department? Why can't we be seen to straight away, etc., etc.? And then there are those who get so overwhelmed by the numbers of things they have to factor in, the speed at which they have to make decisions, the fact that there are no precedents for them to follow, that they actually get disoriented and distressed in the process. They don't know what to do, they don't know who to ask or who to turn to, and they haven't the confidence to do it themselves, and they literally freeze. So it's not flight or fight, as it's often put. It's flight, freeze, or fight. And these are people who freeze. They get more and more distressed, but they don't actually do anything about it. Now, what I go on to argue, I'm going to have to put this very, very briefly, is that over historical time, the dominant modes of reflexivity throughout society, all of which are the product, if you look at one chapter of the reflexive imperative, of whether you receive relational goods or evils in the initial family setting, and then these are reinforced as goods and evils relationally by your friends in the local community and the friends you make at school. If there is a school. So, if we conceive of very loosely of a traditional social order, simple, very simple societies, some of which still exist today, these are places where there is not much variation in either the roles that people occupy or the ideas that they hold. So there's little ideational diversity in culture and little social differentiation in structure, and that leads to usually to a very stable social order in which the context confronted continues to be stable, not identical, but continues to be stable over the generations and over the geographical area. Not perfectly so, because society, social relations are an open system, and contingencies like climatic events can always occur. I mean, tsunamis are not just something brought about by global warming, though they may have been increased in number by global warming. So there are always things like that to take into account, but by and large, it's contextual continuity for each generation that's born into these societies, and it fosters and favors communicative reflexivity. Going back to one interesting discussion this morning that you brought up about learning, learning in this context of continuity can very much be by imitation, induction, follow the parents around, do much the same things to the vegetation or the animals, depending on the area. Whereas when we move to modernity, we take this great shift to contextual discontinuity. New ideas come about. If we take Europe, if we take the 18th century, beginning of, we got tremendous diversity of new ideas about almost every subject. And this also meant about things like the economy. So it is no surprise that at the end of the Enlightenment, we got the physiocrats, Quesnay, Turgot, moving on, and it's the beginning of the next century a bit, and that they were conceptualizing the economics of modernity in very much capitalistic terms. And ones that disturbed, if you remember, Émile Durkheim very greatly in the 19th century. I mean, he earned the label in French, the worried man of the Third Republic. How could social solidarity be restored? how could contextual continuity be restored? And if you remember, the end of the division of labour, the final chapter is called The Pathologies of the Division of Labour. Emile Durkheim behaved like a doctor. He makes his prescriptions for how things could be improved. Abolish inherited wealth, and you will reduce inequality. Make all children attend the same school, sit next to one another on the same school benches, he literally said. And again, you will reduce inequality, and you will do it over the generations by providing every child with an equal start. Occupational associations, and so forth and so on. He was quite radical. And one of the things he was particularly scared about was, he didn't call it this, of course, autonomous reflexivity. That people were thinking for themselves. They were not thinking relationally. They were not behaving how he had wanted them and thought they would behave under the organic solidarity represented by functional differentiation and people doing different jobs but still being relationally interdependent with one another. I couldn't teach unless somebody else was looking after my kids and somebody else was cleaning my house and doing the shopping and that sort of thing. So he wanted this contextual discontinuity overridden and improved by these remedies. What he didn't see coming was meta-reflexivity, which I think is the relational child of what I call contextual incongruity. There are certain things that, certainly growing up in Britain as a child, one was taught. And one of them, and it's there immortalized in cultural artifacts. Do you know what the piggy bank is? The little box, usually in the shape of a pig or some animal, with a slot. And every child was taught savings. To save, to display thrift was a virtue. And therefore, the younger you started, putting your money away in the piggy bank or the biscuit tin or whatever it was, it doesn't matter, you would grow up to be a thrifty adult. You would save from your first earnings something of what you earned, and that will be providing your own cushion against hard times, joblessness, or whatever it may have been. But there's a snag with that, isn't there? When inflation is running high, it's the most stupid thing to do to save money. Because whatever you save is worth less the next day, the next month, the next year, than it was when you saved it. So under times of inflation, spend, spend, spend. So it's difficult to be told one thing from your parents and another thing from your school who is trying to teach you about responsible uses of spending money or earned money and so on. And so many things become incongruent during the supposedly smooth socialization that used to be portrayed by Parsons and his followers as just internalization. But you can't internalize contradictory messages, at least not if they're meant to be guides to what you do. I think I'm committing every sin under the book. That's a bit of contextual incongruity, to learn that one kind of instrument is interfering with another kind of instrument. because it conflicts actually with sort of good manners of, you know, keep your own personal space discreet from your neighbours so that you're not an inconvenience to them. Now, if everything starts to become like this, you know, first of all, you get things like, do you have them in Poland? We call them agony aunts, people you write to in newspapers, you know, I love my boyfriend so much, but he is not asking me to marry him. What can I do to encourage him? Because in previous times, he would not have been your boyfriend, you would not have been walking out with him, allowed to be seen out with him, unless he had the approval of your family that this was a relationship they acknowledged. So almost everything is becoming contradictory. Which messages should they take? And the greatest relational thing fostering meta-reflexivity is when young people are forced to pick a mix. They can't take both. They can't be conventionalists. They can't just weigh which relationship they value the more, as they could under modernity. They have to choose, and in choosing, in a sense, they become free. They become free not just to be constrained by the choices made available in the family, but free to consider the whole range of new ideas that they come across in books, on the internet, on TV, anywhere they find it. Now, I'm going to have to move on very quickly and skip over some of this. That is simply to show you the morphostatic scenario when culture and its outcomes, when culture and its outcomes reinforce structure and its outcomes. So the whole thing just circulates around and is reinforcing. That is the home of communicative reflexivity. Not Bourdieu, who never believed in reflexivity anyway, despite what some of his Western translators, American translators say. Nor did modernity provide the relations that were necessary for a growth and variation in modes of reflexivity. Firstly, because they only involved a minority of the population. The vast majority could continue with traditional routine action. Secondly, because modernity was a very slow process. May seem very fast in some of the novels, you know, the way in which factories sprung up. And if you read Père Goriot, Balzac's wonderful, you know, sort of display of how saving patterns and inheritance patterns in the family stop working when factories and investments, corporate investments come along. Now again, not everybody is involved. Some people undergo some groups undergo one dramatic change. England probably has the best example, being the first to industrialize, which was a very rapid rural depopulation and resettlement of a large percentage of rural workers in towns as factory workers. And these people, this is the source, if any of you have come across it, of the Bethnal Green studies, which found that community was still alive and well in a London suburb. And if you ever visit Bethnal Green, it's very like Tooting Bec. It is incredibly urban, But they developed all sorts of relational practices because they were there for such a long time without much changing, of co-care of children and old people and disabled relatives and friends, that they, in a sense, were not part of things like the growing trade unionist movement from the 1840s onwards. They were not part. Have you seen this new movie that's out called Suffragette? That movie shows them right at the end of the suffragette movement itself, so we're already into the 20th century, as workers in the East End who, as women, do join the franchise movement and become, some of them do, and become very passionate about it, including Emily Dickinson, the one who threw herself in, Emily Robinson, sorry, not the poetess, threw herself in front of the King's horse at the Derby. Now, what are they being confronted with? A really serious decision to choose, which I just call joining a social movement. If you were a worker, you had to weigh getting paid today against striking tomorrow and having greater justice the day after. And it was a very, very hard choice to make if you had, 10 plus dependent children. So struggles, including workers' struggles, were sectional, participation was optional, and not all were affected. So it isn't until we get into late modernity that we get the conditions for meta-reflexivity. I mean, to stop.
No, just 2 minutes.
Okay, 2 more minutes. And we get theories like Ulrich Beck's and Giddens's reflexive modernization. Now, there is nothing about reflexivity in that book, Reflexive Modernization. All it's about are that the sins of capitalism that ignores the environment get brought back by other groups who have suffered from them, and there's a demonstration, and something does or doesn't happen. But if you look at those quotes, it's a sort of song of praise to individualism. But if you look at that very last bullet point, which says that agents cannot act in a rational and responsible manner, that is, with reference to the possible consequences, that's a complete denigration of agential activity, the active agent. It's a denigration of relationality, that you can get together and do together and think out together and reflect together. Because there's nothing about an internal conversation that prevents you from sharing it with other people, but you monitor it. You control what you tell. You don't tell all. And it is a denial that people can make a difference in their own lives, take some responsibility for how they make their way through the world, and how they do, to go back to somebody who was interestingly quoted this morning, Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor is not in the secular age. It's a little article called Unity of a Life. And he argues that reflexively, that's what we all strive for. A life of some coherence, not just in the logical sense that we don't endorse any propositions that are contradictory, but in the sense that we live in some kind of harmony with our social context, some kind of relational harmony with our fellow human beings, and some kind of natural harmony with our natural environment, which is what Laudato Si is all about, looking after our common home. So the problem is that structure and culture start reinforcing one another and speeding up change. There's no need to go into how much change there's been with digitalization. It's enormous. There's no need to go into how much change there's been with the monetarization of the economy. That's affected every single area of the world. And there's no need to go into how far it's changed individual lives through social media, Facebook and the like, which produce what one of our research group, Mark Carrigan, calls distracted people. People who are constantly being bombarded by Amazon and eBay and Google and all the others to do something in particular. So, this is where people, I argue, stand at the moment. Never mind. So, let's just finish on the fact that habitus peters out. All those people who want to keep Bourdieu's memory alive, well, he never said habitus went on forever. He never said reflexivity was important other than within a research collective group. And he never committed the idiocy of saying that routine action can guide your what you do for all time, or the sub-proposition that some people have developed who want to hang on to something of routine action or routinized action, namely that any innovative action, any new doing, has to be built upon the basis of past habits. I think that's a proposition that can very easily be falsified, because what kind of habit or habitus can a practice like stock exchange dealing or devising new forms of software or inventing something like the sale of economic derivatives or drone warfare or any of the kinds of chemical and physiological interventions that make us more than human, superhuman, enhanced human, what sort of habits can they be built upon? There don't seem to me to be any ready contenders. So in conclusion, what should we expect in this new millennium? And I just want to say the last, what have I done? Gone back to the beginning, that was no good. How do I get back to the end? Here we are. So just look at the 4 bullet points underneath one another. As far as one can see ahead at the moment, and realists don't make too many predictions, they can make some. Too much can be made of it being utterly unpredictive. So as far as this collection of empirical studies done by in-depth interview are concerned, it looks as though in the future that communicative reflexivity as a dominant mode is in decline, that autonomous reflexivity remains stable while ever capitalism remains buoyant, that meta-reflexivity is on the increase, but that so is fractured reflexivity and the sort of victims of decision-making in more rapidly changing circumstances. So in view of all those changes, that's my justification for saying why it's worthwhile studying reflexivity and the internal conversation to understand how structure and culture condition agency. Thank you very much.